Hello! It's LVLS Weekly Time, episode 51. So first things first, I spent a good chunk of my vacation thinking about this show. And what I want to kind of do moving forward is I want to not have it run for like 45 minutes to an hour. I feel like that's a bit long in terms of editing and for people to watch. So my goal moving forward is to try to make this more like a half an hour or less. We'll see how well that goes, but that is the intention moving forward. So I wanted to say that before we get into the rest of our content today. So with that in mind, I've got a couple pickups I want to talk about, and then I'm going to address two rather large news pieces. E3 and Pac Man, oddly enough. So let's do the pickups real quick. So I got a couple books. So I got Diversifying Barbie and Mortal Kombat, the third in this series of gender cross video games. This one is more about intersectional perspectives, which I think is fantastic. I looked at the table of contents and I'm very excited to give this a read. I also got Stephen Kent's second Ultimate History of Video Games. This just came out last year. Been 20 years since he wrote the last one, and this one moves further down the road, so it gets up to the Wii, I think. I really enjoyed the first book, so I'm excited to see how the second book turns out. So, in case you didn't hear, E3's canceled this year. There's no virtual event, there's no in-person event. It's gone. It's done, not happening. So, as someone who has taken time off of work for the last few years, specifically to participate in E3, I have conflicting feelings. And E3 is such a complicated event in terms of what it means and why this cancellation has an impact. It's become like the marquee event for reveals for a lot of companies, but over the last few years, several have backed away from doing E3 altogether. And I want to say that Nintendo actually kind of kickstarted that trend by moving their events from in-person on-stage presentations to the Nintendo Direct format. And in that process, really invited an entirely new way of marketing video games to their fans. They could talk directly, to borrow Iwata's famous quote / hand gesture, to the people that they wanted to sell the games to. And while Nintendo Directs have certainly had their ups and downs, I feel like as of right now, they're pretty solidly produced and are engaging and are exciting, and people watch them and do reaction videos. I've started doing that. There's just a lot of fun around this idea of doing virtual events. And then COVID happened and really pushed that over the edge. So now a lot of companies are doing it. Prior to that, though, Sony had backed off. Electronic Arts had backed off. Devolver had backed off. So, like, a lot of companies are not looking at E3, the event itself, as the means of marketing like it used to be. They're looking at it as the week of marketing instead of E3 itself. So, while E3's canceled, I don't foresee that really impacting a lot of changes for, like, Nintendo. They'll probably drop a Direct that week. Jeff Keighley of Game Awards fame does his Summer Games Fest and basically now has the entirety of the summer to own that type of stuff. So I'm sure that with E3 being canceled, he's been reaching out to all kinds of companies to have them be a part of Summer Games Fest instead. So I don't think that overall that E3's cancellation is going to really have an impact on the June game hype that's going to be generated. I think that a lot of companies will just do their own thing or work with Jeff Keighley, or with other companies that will want to do stuff around that time. And there's a lot more options now than just E3. A lot of smaller companies are connecting with the new Games Plus direct-like presentations, like Natsume and NIS America, Arc System Works, companies that don't have the huge draw of like a Capcom or a Konami or a Square Enix, but are capable of having their stuff shown at this type of event that works out great. There's also a lot more indie-focused events. The Wholesome Direct is a great example of a group of people that decided, you know what, we want to spotlight more lighthearted, less violent, more heartfelt games, more emotional games. And they filled a void, and I really enjoy watching Wholesome Directs because I usually find a couple things that catch my interest. E3 claims that they'll be back next year. The problem is that by canceling this year, I think the Electronic Software Association, I think that's the ESA, basically has given carte blanche to eliminating themselves out of the equation this year. And I think they're going to find when they attempt to do this next year that there's not going to be a whole lot of draw. And that's ultimately a good thing because the ESA has not run E3 very well. A few years ago, there was a huge leak of personal information for just about all media that attended that particular E3. I want to say that was 2018 or 2019. So basically they doxed the entirety of Games Press, and not great, not a good look. And ultimately the history of E3 is just rife with a lot of sexism and a lot of exclusionary tactics. When E3 got started, and through a good chunk of the 2000s, it had booth babes. It had a focus on hypersexualization of women in multiple ways. When you look at photos of those particular times, there's just not a lot of women outside of those hired to fill those roles wandering around. And it's part of the overall marketing arm that video games developed following Nintendo releasing the Nintendo Entertainment System, where they created a niche of video games that was boys only, and you can see it. And that's part of why I'm doing Femtendo, is I'm trying to show this process in the games themselves, because if you compare Japan to the United States, there's a lot more women in games in Japan than there are in the United States. And if you look at marketing, and you look at commercials, and you look at all this stuff, it's targeted towards boys. And E3 was more than happy to continue that perpetuation of the myth that women aren't into video games. And it's really hard for some people to acknowledge that that is wrong and false. So, with E3 bowing out this year, I kind of hope it just bows out forever. The event has served its purpose. And I think that we now have alternative ways to have video game hype generated without this type of event facilitating it. Before we jump into our second news story, let's take a little cat intermission. Welcome back. Pac-Land came out in 1984. Why am I talking about it? Well, it turns out that Pac Man here, while a Bandai Namco IP, has some shenanigans going on in its history. There is a fantastic article that Polygon did a couple years ago talking about that situation, which I will link in the description, but I will summarize it thus. Midway licensed Pac Man for North American distribution in like 1981-82 and released the game. And it was a huge success in America as well as in Japan. So Midway got greedy and couldn't wait for Namco to create more sequels. So they created their own. They hired a small independent studio, General Electric Computers or Computing, I don't remember exactly, or Great Eastern or something like that. I will put the proper name down here because I don't remember off the top of my head. They hired this outside firm to create a couple sequels for the game for America without really letting Namco know. And this is Ms. Pac-Man and Baby Pac-Man, as well as a couple others that came along the way. I want to say Junior Pac-Man also falls under this arrangement that Midway had. When Namco found out, they were upset and basically barred Midway from continuing that business relationship and claimed ownership of their IP that had been taken from them and used illegally. Several years later, we still had this arrangement that Bandai Namco, which had merged with Bandai at this point, still had the rights to Ms. Pac-Man and the other Pac-Man games, but had to kind of work out something with this group that still existed that developed the original game to just like, because they had some weird split IP ownership thing. It's complicated. But because the game was so successful and the game made so much money, even today, I mean, you could still find Ms. Pac-Man arcade cabinets floating around in like movie theaters and pizza places, stuff like that. It was a fruitful arrangement until a third party gets involved. So, At Games is a third-party retro console company that doesn't make very high-quality products. They don't have a whole lot going on like they used to, but if you were at a Target or a Walmart or a Best Buy and you saw these miniature arcade cabinets with Namco games and like the clone Genesis consoles that were before the Genesis Mini, that was At Games. They had arrangements with a few other companies as well, but they didn't have great emulation. Their hardware parts were not particularly great. They kind of developed a reputation of being a little dishonest, a little seedy, a little sketch. They went around Bandai Namco and talked to the people who developed Ms. Pac-Man and released a Ms. Pac-Man machine without Bandai Namco's consent. Well, Bandai Namco didn't like that, so they got into a lawsuit with At Games. Well, At Games retaliated by buying out the developer and taking in all their IP. So now they split the IP of Ms. Pac-Man and the other Pac-Man games that this company made with Bandai Namco. So if Bandai Namco ever wants to release Ms. Pac-Man, they have to go through At Games. So that is why the last time Ms. Pac-Man was released by Bandai Namco was with the original Pac-Man Museum, which came out 2013, 2014, somewhere around there. Fast forward to recently. Bandai Namco is releasing a brand new Pac-Man Museum collection, Pac-Man Museum Plus. Ms. Pac-Man's not included. It's not even DLC like it was in the original Pac-Man Museum. It's not there. The character Miss Pac-Man is also not there. She has been replaced with an entirely brand new Pac character named Pac-Mom, I think is what officially her name is. And that brings us to Pac-Land. The Arcade Archives release just came out this last week, and Miss Pac-Man and Baby Pac, I don't remember what the child's name was in Pac-Land, are no longer in the game. This 1984 release has been altered to remove Miss Pac-Man from it, and Pac-Mom and a replacement Pac-Baby has been sprite edited into the game. And Pac-Man Museum Plus is going to do this as well, because Pac-Land is also on there. And there's also the ability to buy, like, decorations for your arcade room, and Pac-Mom is in there, not Miss Pac-Man. So, Miss Pac-Man is effectively being ostracized from canon by Bandai Namco because of @Games. And this is fascinating and disquieting at the same time, because Miss Pac-Man, as a character, was the most famous female video game protagonist of the 1980s, without question. We could get into the 90s and debate Chun-Li versus Lara Croft, but in terms of the 80s, no character had more success or brand recognition as a female character than Miss Pac-Man. Period. And that legacy is being erased as we speak because of this situation between @Games and Bandai Namco. The character is being removed, and the game itself is likely to never be released under official capacity until @Games and Bandai Namco find some sort of mutual agreement, which I don't think they're planning on anytime soon. So it's depressing, because in terms of women and female characters in games, we're losing an icon. We're losing a monumental figure in Miss Pac-Man. And if you've ever wondered why Pac-Man here didn't have Miss Pac-Man as an alt in Smash, now you know. It would have been a very easy thing to do, but because of this litigation, it didn't happen. It's not great losing one of the most important female characters in all of video games because of @Games trying to bite Bandai Namco in the ass, basically. So, highly recommend reading the Polygon article. There will also be a second article in there from Polygon with all of the latest about Pac-Land. Just absolutely wild that this is happening, and just really shows how important game preservation is. If you have a copy, treasure it, because we will probably never see it until this gets resolved, come out on anything modern. So I will be holding on to my Namco Museum Volume 3 for the PS1 very closely. Alright, well that's another episode in the proverbial can, so to speak. I hope that you enjoyed my thoughts on E3, the situation with Ms. Pac-Man, and we'll talk a bit about what's going on in Sony Land next time, as well as some other bit of news, I'm sure. So, until then, my friends, thank you so much. Once again, have a wonderful week, and take care.